welcome to this fascinating presentation, which is working with endometriosis, encounters with precarity and policy as solidarity. And I think this is a really important topic because many of us we are dealing with such kind of issues. And I think how women body is treated in science, in policy studies. I think it's a really fascinating topic to discuss. And Vickie Williams is our PGR researcher, and her expertise they deal with how the lived experience, what are the lived experience of endometriosis and the impact of menstrual policy on these lived experiences. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Vickie.
Thanks so much, Amna, and thank you to Nell and Louise for organising today's event. The discussions have been really interesting. So hi everyone, my name's Vickie, and today for International Women's Day, I wanted to focus on some of my findings from researching endometriosis in the workplace. So specifically encounters with precarity and policy as solidarity, both as equality issues. So I wanted to focus on three main areas. So firstly being the embodied precarity of a condition like endometriosis. Secondly, how women navigate and manage this embodied precarity in the workplace. And finally, how protective and supportive policy can be in solidarity with not only people working with endometriosis, but also other menstrual and reproductive health challenges. So firstly, just a little bit more about where this research comes from. So as Amna mentioned, my PhD specifically explores the lived experience of people working with endometriosis and the influence of menstrual policy. It's a qualitative and longitudinal study of 21 cis women who are aged between 19 to 49, and they're working with endometriosis in the UK across 19 different industries. And these range from construction to health and social care, the armed forces to retail, and government to marketing and technology roles. So the women within the study are women who have both been living with symptoms for most of their adult life, so from menarche, which is a first period, and those that have had symptoms begin suddenly whilst working later on. They are women who are just embarking on the beginning of their career, and women who have many years of experience within the labour market. They are also women who have had a swift journey to diagnosis, and others who have waited for more than 20 years. And whilst this study shares experiences from women with the condition, I also wanted to highlight that some transgender men and gender non-conforming people are also living and working with endometriosis. And additionally, while the study is focused on endometriosis, I wanted to point out that a large majority of people who reached out to participate are also living with polycystic ovary syndrome, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, adenomyosis, and other menstrual health conditions, as well as either going or having gone through the menopause transition. So many experiences I'm sharing today will be very similar across other menstrual health conditions. Here today may have heard of it, but may not know much about it. So it's a condition where tissue resembling the lining of the womb grows outside of its home. So it can be found on the ovaries, the bladder, bowel, and also in areas outside of the pelvis, such as the lungs, for instance. And each month when the tissue breaks down and bleeds, it's trapped, leading to inflammation, scar tissue, and adhesions, which literally bind organs together. And this often leads to a host of debilitating chronic symptoms that are non-cyclical or can fluctuate with the menstrual cycle. So symptoms including chronic pelvic pain, heavy periods, extreme fatigue, infertility, depression, and many, many more. And this is pain that when it hits people, people can hardly breathe or walk. It's quite common for people to lose consciousness with the pain. It's much more than just period pain, which often the condition is compared with. And it's these wide-ranging, unpredictable and fluctuating both physical and psychological symptoms that creates a precariousness around the body. And this is one of three areas that I want to focus on today. Firstly being the embodied precarity of endometriosis. So Shildrick defines embodied precarity as parallel to bioprecarity and debility, which encompasses ordinary lives that simply persist in a worn down state without ever getting better. Precarity is quite literally rooted in the body with endometriosis, a condition that can flare at any time without notice of length or severity, limited treatment options, and no cure to date. And this can lead to difficulty for people in the workplace. So pain can lead to frequent absences. Fatigue can reduce the ability to focus and concentrate. Mood swings can affect workplace relationships. Heavy periods and fainting can be extremely embarrassing. And then very severe symptoms can actually impact a person's ability to work at all. So it's important to take a biopsychosocial approach to understanding these experiences, recognizing the condition as inclusive of those physical and psychological symptoms, but also stigma, shame, and social interactions like those in the workplace. So for example, participants spoke of how stress at work, such as dealing with bullying, which is quite common, could bring symptoms on, which adds layers of precarity. And just to draw on some examples of embodied precarity. So starting from left to right, Robin here talks of good days and bad days with endo, and there is no pattern to how her symptoms can impact work. Erin talks of the range in severity of symptoms and how some are manageable, whereas the sudden onset of severe symptoms can mean she needs to leave work quite urgently. Poppy speaks of the constant anxiety of wondering when symptoms are going to happen. And finally, Anna speaks of how fluctuating ability levels limits her confidence to progress within her career. So endometriosis often hinders the ability to work to the same capacity every hour on every day of a traditional working calendar. So we begin to see this tension between masculine time-based norms versus the variability of endometriosis, where women are expected to minimize their symptoms, essentially their embodied precarity, and conform to productive worker expectations. And on the right here, you'll see a powerful quote from Jasmine. And Jasmine has no problem with being creative as part of her craft, but worries she might lose everything if she doesn't conform to being a structured, productive, and regular worker. And this brings to light bodies that are disabled by society if one cannot work on a regular and consistent basis. Of course, all bodies are precarious to some extent. However, if we take a continuum that places the traditional ideal worker, typically characterized as an able-bodied white cis male, who is not only solid and in control, but constantly available, we begin to see how people with endometriosis can't always be a fully productive worker under this regime. The embodied precarity of endometriosis is often shrouded in a lack of understanding and therefore a lack of support in the labour market. And this is made even more difficult by a lack of diagnosis. Having symptoms dismissed and trivialised in the workplace is only a mirror to the experiences received from the medical community, with average diagnosis delays of 8 to 12 years. And some women within the study, it had taken them 20 years for a diagnosis. Relief can come with a diagnosis, but this medical sanction of having a regular condition only confirms the irregularity of the body. Diagnosis doesn't always equal empathy or accommodations in the workplace either, so with a lack of supportive policy that responds to embodied precarity. If anything, people can be caught between existing policies. So sickness policies assume you get sick, you take time out to rest, you recover, and then you return to work. However, they don't account for regular, irregular patterns of sickness. On the other end of the scale is disability policy. Although people with debilitating endometriosis can be classed as disabled under the Equality Act, there's a stigma that they are not disabled regularly or consistently in the same way as, for example, a wheelchair user may be, as their symptoms and disability will always fluctuate through time. So this further reconstructs the body as precarious. Now, this regular irregularity can be present right throughout working life, alongside a culture of disbelief and experiences of non-citizenship. Bloom says, without regular status, it becomes necessary for a person to demonstrate both that they suffer and that this suffering is morally and politically relevant, even if they fulfill other dimensions of citizenship. So the medical and social journey experienced with endometriosis doubles up on the precariousness of the body. It represents a series of paradoxes layered on top of one another. So with limited understanding and support in the workplace, how do women navigate this embodied precarity? Participants spoke of concealing their condition because of the stigma attached to it or fear of being seen as unreliable. Others spoke of a disclosure dance where people revealed their condition in certain circumstances, for example, with fluctuating workability. Many engaged in body work and blood work to mask their leaky and unpredictable bodies, their precariousness, to gain acceptance and fit in with organisational norms. And almost all participants discussed how common it was for them to work through this pain. Many took holidays to rest or deal with symptoms and avoid triggers leading to disciplinaries. And others tried to alter when and how work was carried out, of which many requests were denied by organisations or implemented and then ignored. Some participants implemented pacing as a self-management strategy for activity and against the worsening symptoms that too much activity brings. They devised a rhythm of work that allowed rest or multiple rest periods within their typical working day. And examples included altering work schedules, such as if symptoms presented in the morning or afternoon, and working from home. In some cases, the embodied precarity of endometriosis was temporarily ameliorated during COVID, with many participants expressing their ability to better cope with the condition because of less pressure to mask their symptoms, but also being in a safe environment where they could run a hot bath or lie down if they needed to. Some participants relied on heavy use of medication to get them through the working day, but they had to plan this quite carefully to ensure that they could still have full control of their body when commuting, for example. Some relied on supportive management. However, support could change with a change in manager, emphasising the lack of continuity and protection here, another precarious layer. Others, as we saw earlier with Anna's experience, felt their conditions prevented them from progressing further. Others moved into part-time roles or precarious work drawn by the flexibility they offer. However, the supposed flexibility is often a double bind with lack of stable contracts, loss of state provisioning, and the financial impact of having to take time off for flare-ups or surgery, often multiple surgeries. Embodied precarity may therefore make precarious work and precarious ways of working more appealing to women with endometriosis because of this promise of flexibility, but they may equally feel and be even less protected. Some participants considered leaving the workforce entirely, which is unfortunately a very common thing with working with endometriosis. So some experiences of navigating embodied precarity in the workplace. So moving from left to right again, in Harriet's diary entry to begin with, she documents a challenging night that came out of the blue. She was up with pain, vomiting, and diarrhea, which almost made her pass out. She wants to call in sick, but instead works through the pain and tiredness. Hanny's experience in the middle shares her experience of leaving full-time employment to be a freelancer which at first she was faced with many financial difficulties, but says it was worth it, even with little protections now, to have control of when and how much time off she needs to recalibrate. And Thea had trained endlessly in her passion to become a swim teacher. However, fluctuating symptoms made it difficult to work in this environment regularly, and therefore she felt she had no choice but to leave her dream job. Ultimately, navigating embodied precarity in the workplace means the body bears the physical and psychological burden in continuous self-management and self-coping strategies, which SEER has identified as the third shift. So in solidarity with these experiences, how do we welcome precarity rooted in the body at work? How do we ensure people are not working through pain, not prevented from working in their desired professions, or not pushed into precarious forms of work or out of the workforce entirely? A way to break the bias is through the introduction of protective policy. And if we look to policies currently available for women's experiences in the workplace, we have maternity policy and the growing rise of menopause policy. However, it could be argued that such policies only affect a proportion of a person's career, whereas menstruation and menstrual conditions like endometriosis can and do affect the entirety of a person's career, and yet this is an area lacking supportive policy. Policy is needed in the workplace, policy that responds with the biopsychosocial approach at both a structural and organisational level. And this can help to minimise the third shift and create more equitable, healthy workplaces. In conversations with participants, we discussed ideas on what protective policy looks like. Many were unaware of existing protections under the Disability Act and didn't believe it would apply to them. Some said they would use the protections, whereas others felt uncomfortable, as we've already discussed, or didn't identify as disabled. Others felt that they would benefit from having access to a more specific menstrual wellbeing policy, and that it could help to normalise the conversations around menstrual health and related conditions in the workplace, offer training and education to managers on how they could best support their employees. And here many spoke of managers who wanted to help, but either didn't know how or were restricted by lack of organisational policy and practices. A menstrual wellbeing policy could also help ensure pain days are not detrimental to a person's performance or progression, and ensure people with undiagnosed menstrual conditions are supported at work. As we've spoken about, endometriosis takes an average of 8 to 12 years to be diagnosed. So menstrual policy essentially gives people permission to respond to their embodied precarity. And an interesting point that Iris identifies here on the right is to be able to prevent a flare of symptoms is just as important to manage it. However, there were lots of considerations also raised in relation to this. Some believed the menstrual policy would further stigmatise people in the workplace, especially given the lack of understanding of different menstrual experiences. Many had felt dismissed by the medical profession and believed menstrual policy would equally be as dismissively received in the workplace. Also, not all menstruating bodies identify as female, so there is a potential discomfort of using a policy with this language. Others felt it indicated a once-in-a-month issue, which could be problematic because symptoms don't always correlate with menstruation, or in a certain week of a month, it can be across the month. There also needs to be thought on how menstrual policy would be applied to different industries, for example, construction and hospitality, where physical bodies are needed to deliver a service, as opposed to office roles where work can often be made much more flexible. And a last consideration, people with severe endometriosis can also have involvement with other organs, and they felt that this policy wouldn't be enough to protect them alone. So just some final thoughts here. So there aren't any clear or easy answers here on what future policy looks like to support embodied precarity in the workplace. But what is clear is the urgent need for policy that gives people the permission to respond to their embodied and changeable needs without carrying this burden alone, being penalised or pushed out of the labour market completely. Thank you.
Thank you, Vickie, for your fascinating talk and presentation. We have some questions in the chat box. So one question is, I think, Bon Corey. Thanks, Vickie. Do you have thoughts, data on disclosure of endometriosis in the workplace? For example, regarding support, advantages, and/or threats to workplace inclusion, career progression, etc.
I'm just going to read this question again. So in terms of disclosure, it's really so mixed, and it really depends on, I guess, I've seen quite a lot that it depends on the person that you're disclosing to. So some people, some managers are extremely supportive and can ensure that actually progression isn't hindered by endometriosis and the changing work patterns that sometimes come with that. However, other people have disclosed to the management and their teams, and it's actually made workplace bullying and discrimination worse. Even one lady, after disclosing endometriosis, basically a whole team, a manager, had said to her that, you know, her endometriosis was hindering the rest of the team's performance and progression, and requested that she actually move teams. I hope that's answered your question, Ilaria.
Yes, that sounds good. And we have another question from Nella. Would you like to read it?
Yeah, bear with me a second. So again, Nella, I think it's quite a mixed answer. So it's both experiences being trivialized and dismissed in the medical profession, but it's also, I think, a larger issue within society, in the fact that many people through generations, whether that be medical or outside of the medical sphere, have been taught that period pain is just normal. So actually, people don't know what that normal is, for instance. So people think that they're either weak, that they can't, I guess, deal with the pain, and they think that everyone else is dealing with the same pain around them, but actually they're not, essentially. So I think there's just lots of misinformation and understanding in society about that.
Yeah, I have another question for you, Vickie. Like, so in terms of how much this issue goes back to patriarchal structures in our society, because changing workplace policies can be a way, but if the issue is structural, how do you think we can address this? Because even in scientific communities, doctors sometimes, most of the times, they do not recognize period pain as an issue. Which can be quite an big issue. I have this condition myself. I called NHS once, and they said, "Oh, that's not an issue. You just go and have any over-the-counter medication." But I have been living with this condition for last, I don't know, 10 years now. So I just wonder how much this issue is structural, and how we can address it. Thank you.
I think that's a huge question, and I'd love to give you, I guess, an answer for that. And I think it comes down to a huge lack of awareness, which then impacts research funding. So we know endometriosis and menstrual health conditions, there isn't the research happening, there's not the funding happening, there's not that awareness in medical communities. And it's a big question to address, essentially. I think helping raise awareness. And I think although there are, as I mentioned, lots of considerations about menstrual wellbeing policy in the workplace, but I think having that policy kind of addresses the need and hopefully will I guess, encourage people to recognize it more. So I know last year the BBC did a huge news piece and research on endometriosis, and it went out to lots of different platforms, and that was actually picked up by lots of participants, because people were coming, colleagues of theirs and even family members around them were coming to them and saying, oh wow, I actually didn't realize it was that bad. So I think just that awareness, information and education around that can have a huge impact.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Joe. Do you think that growing attention to menopause as a workplace issue might provide a foundation for more attention to endometriosis in the same context and other, repromenstrual conditions?
Definitely, and I think menopause is the attention of menopause experiences in the workplace is really opening up an avenue for endometriosis and other menstrual-related conditions. Especially, so I've been doing some work with government, and they're actually looking towards lots of the work that's been happening around the menopause now to see actually what can be done for endometriosis. So it's created a platform that include other experiences.
Yeah, that sounds good. And we have a fascinating comment there. Patriarchy perhaps normalizes cis white hetero men and their medical conditions as the normal. The rest of us, like even this book by Caroline Perez, Invisible Women, Data Biases, she mentions that when it comes to men, there are a lot of medications which deal with their pleasures in a market. But when it comes to women's period pain, there are probably not many. So it talks a lot how capitalism thrives on patriarchy in ways and backward. But thank you so much, Vickie, for this fascinating talk, and everyone else. And we have another session, I believe, next. And thank you, everyone. And we're just gonna finish it here.